The air in the courtroom was thick, recycled and stale, dragging heavy in my lungs as I tried to keep my breathing steady. Everyone's eyes were glued to the 80-inch monitor mounted on the far wall. The video feed playing was black and white, grainy but horrifyingly high definition, cutting through the silence of the room like a razor. Then came the audio, digitally enhanced and deafeningly clear. The wet, desperate sound of someone struggling for air, followed by a whisper that chilled the marrow of my bones. "Die quietly, Gracie." I shifted my gaze from the screen to the defendant's table to look at my stepbrother Julian, the family's untouchable, golden boy who had spent his life believing consequences were things that happened to other people. He wasn't smirking now. He was pale, trembling so hard the water pitcher on his table rattled against the glass. Next to him, his high-priced defense attorney, a shark my stepfather had paid a fortune to retain, slowly closed his thick folder. There was a specific look of resignation on the lawyer's face. The sinking realization that no amount of money or legal maneuvering could explain away what we had all just heard. To understand how my life ended up being played back for a jury of strangers, you have to go back just 48 hours. I had come home early from a shift to find my apartment door unlocked. My stomach dropped, that primal instinct warning me of danger. I walked down the hallway and found Julian inside my home office, tearing through my drawers with frantic, drug-fueled energy. He was looking for cash, anything he could pawn to cover his mounting gambling debts. He was tossing aside what he thought were just computer parts, completely unaware. He was standing in the middle of a secure server room I used for work. "Julian, get out," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. He didn't apologize. He didn't panic. He just snapped. A switch flipped behind his eyes, turning his usual entitlement into a cold, homicidal rage. "You always have to be the hero, don't you, Gracie?" He sneered. He lunged at me before I could reach for my phone. The leather belt he wore, an expensive designer piece my mother had bought him for his birthday, came off in a blur. The struggle was terrifyingly brief. I felt the leather clamp around my throat, cutting off my scream before it even started. My vision tunneled into darkness as the pressure crushed my windpipe. For 12 seconds, my pulse vanished, and I ceased to exist. When I finally gasped back into consciousness, throat on fire, I lay still on the floor, too weak to move. Through cracked eyelids, I watched Julian. He was stepping over my body with a casual arrogance, taking a cloth to wipe his fingerprints off the door handle. He smirked, looking down at me one last time, convinced he had just gotten away with murder. He thought he was clever because he'd wiped a few surfaces. He had no idea that the room wasn't just a home office. It was a testing ground for government-grade surveillance tech. He thought he had committed the perfect crime in the dark. He didn't know he was standing inside a devastatingly illuminated trap, designed by the very expert he'd spent a lifetime mocking. My stepfather, Frank, a man who measured human worth exclusively by the zeros in a bank account, had a simple philosophy for raising children: investment versus expense. Julian, my stepbrother, the family's reckless golden boy who wore his charisma like a get-out-of-jail-free card, was the investment. I watched Frank sign checks for 3 different DUIs and a bar fight assault charge that was quietly pleaded down to disorderly conduct, all while claiming Julian was just high-spirited. Meanwhile, I was the expense, the drab invisible fixture in the guest room who spent too much time on computers and not enough time smiling at country club mixers. To them, I was just Gracie the it girl, resetting passwords for a generic logistics company. A convenient, boring lie I maintained to keep them from asking questions I legally couldn't answer. I remember the last family dinner we had before the attack, sitting there while Frank dissected my life between heavy bites of steak. He pointed his fork at me, a gesture of casual dominance he loved to use, and laughed about the new biometric lock I'd installed on my bedroom door. He called it performative paranoia, lecturing me loudly about how my security cameras made his house guests feel monitored and uncomfortable. I sat there, gripping my napkin until my knuckles turned white, listening to him mock the very instincts that kept me alive. I thought about the tuition money that vanished when I needed it, only to reappear as a shiny new convertible for Julian. And I forced a stiff, polite smile. They saw a frightened little girl hiding behind deadbolts they didn't. To see that I wasn't locking the world out, I was locking my reality in. If Frank had ever looked past his own ego, he might have noticed that IT help desk workers don't get pulled out of bed at 3 a.m. by unmarked sedans to go to secure locations. The truth was, I wasn't resetting routers or troubleshooting printers. I was a senior digital forensics examiner for the Department of Justice. My world wasn't about corporate spreadsheets, it was about the absolute authentication of digital evidence in high treason cases and counterterrorism operations. I lived in the gray area between truth and fabrication, the person the federal government called when they needed to know if a warlord's execution video was real, or a deepfake designed to destabilize a region. Just 48 hours before Julian choked the life out of me, I wasn't listening to Frank's lectures, I was sitting inside a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility where the air is scrubbed and cell phones are confiscated at the blast doors. I was staring at a pixelated feed of a potential terror threat, running a variable frame rate analysis to check for temporal artifacts that would indicate tampering. My boss, Section Chief Miller, a man who hadn't smiled since the 90s, stood over my shoulder waiting for my verdict before launching a raid. I wasn't guessing, I was executing metadata extraction and running a biometric gate, matching algorithm that broke down the suspect's walk into mathematical certainty. When I gave the sign-off, tactical teams moved. In that cold, windowless room, my word was law. But, at home, I was just Gracie, the paranoid nerd who didn't know how to have fun. That duality crashed down the moment I woke up on my floor, the silence of the apartment ringing in my ears like a siren. The pain was immediate and encompassing, a hot, throbbing ring of fire around my neck where the leather had bitten into my skin. I tried to swallow and gagged, the taste of copper filling my mouth. My first instinct should have been to call 911, to scream for help. But the training, the deep ingrained protocol of my other life, overrode the panic. I didn't reach for a phone, I crawled. I dragged myself across the carpet, my limbs heavy and shaking, until I reached the hidden terminal beneath my desk. My fingers trembled violently as I typed in the decryption key, a 32-character string that lived only in my muscle memory. I needed to see the logs. I needed to know the system had worked. The screen flickered to life, the blue glow stinging my eyes, and there it was, the file transfer log. I checked the SHA-256 hash value, the digital fingerprint. That proved the video file hadn't been corrupted or altered during the upload. It matched perfectly. The footage of Julian trying to kill me was already encrypted, redundant, and locked in a server that Frank's money couldn't touch. I slumped back against the desk leg, tears finally mixing with the blood on my face, feeling a cold, grim satisfaction. Frank always told me I needed to stop living in a fantasy world and get a real job, like Julian's internship. If only he knew that in my world, men like Julian don't get internships, they get processed. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed, the sterile paper crinkling under my legs, while my parents performed their usual cleanup routine. Frank didn't look at the purple, hand-shaped bruises blooming on my neck. He was too busy pacing the room checking his watch. He started the spin immediately. Julian was stressed. It was just a sibling scuffle, and surely I had provoked him. My mother, a woman who believed peace was more important than fairness, chimed in with the financial solution. She quietly suggested they would cover my medical bills, and maybe even pay off my student loans. If I just let this go to protect Julian's law school application. I looked at them, and I felt a cold, familiar clarity. They were banking on the old dynamic, my word against their golden boy's potential. They didn't know I wasn't playing that game anymore. I waited for them to leave, then I picked up my phone. I didn't call the local police, who Frank played golf with every Sunday. I dialed my cousin, Elena, an assistant district attorney in the neighboring county who viewed Frank's checkbook diplomacy with open disdain. I wasn't calling for a shoulder to cry on, I was calling to deliver a payload. "I'm sending you a package," I whispered, my voice raspy and broken. "It's not a family dispute, Elena. It's a federal-grade case file." From my hospital bed, I opened my secure laptop and went to work. I didn't just drag and drop a video file like a civilian. I treated my own assault with the same clinical precision I applied to counter-terrorism cases. I generated a full forensic authenticity report, digitally signing the metadata to establish an unbreakable chain of custody. I included the hash values, the frame rate analysis, and the biometric lock logs, ensuring that no defense attorney could claim the footage was deep-faked or altered. I wasn't giving them a story they could poke holes in. I was handing them a weaponized dossier of mathematical facts. The fallout was swift and surgically precise. Elena filed for attempted murder and aggravated assault within the hour, bypassing the local precinct entirely. While Frank was likely ordering a celebratory scotch at the country club, thinking he had handled me, deputies were marching onto the putting green. They didn't ask Julian for his side of the story. They cuffed him in front of the entire membership committee. They thought they could buy my silence with a check for my medical bills. But you can't bribe a chain of custody log, and you certainly can't negotiate with a cloud server backed by federal encryption. The bail hearing wasn't about justice for my stepfather, Frank. It was just another transaction. A problem to be solved with the right amount of leverage and a heavy check. He sat in the front row checking his watch, confident that his expensive lawyer, a man whose suit cost more than my entire college education, would make this inconvenience disappear. The attorney didn't look at me, he looked through me, painting a picture for the judge of a troubled stepsister prone to hysteria and exaggeration. Your Honor, he droned, his voice dripping with condescension, we are dealing with a family dispute. Blown out of proportion by a young woman with a documented history of emotional instability. I gripped the edge of the bench, remembering every time Frank had dismissed my feelings as drama or hormones, effectively erasing my reality to suit his narrative. The lawyer ramped up the offensive, leaning into the microphone with practiced disdain to deliver the final blow to my credibility. He argued that the bruises on my neck could be self-inflicted, or perhaps the result of a consensual struggle that got out of hand. We have no proof of these events, he declared, sweeping his hand toward the empty air, other than the hearsay of a stepsister who has always resented the defendant's success. It was a masterclass in gaslighting, designed to make the victim look like the villain. I watched Julian, who was sitting up straighter now, emboldened by the lie, smirking just like he did when he left me on the floor. He thought he had won again. Then Elena stood up. She didn't shout, she didn't need to. Your Honor, the people submit Exhibit A, she said, her voice cutting through the defense's fog like a laser. High-definition audio-visual surveillance, authenticated by a certified subject matter expert. The large monitors on the wall flickered to life, and the room went dead silent. It wasn't the grainy, shaky footage they expected from a cheap home security camera. It was 4K clarity, capturing every bead of sweat, every dilated pupil, and every split second of violence in terrifying detail. We all watched the screen as Julian lunged. The sound was the worst part, the sickening wet thud of the belt hitting my skin. The guttural struggle of my lungs, trying to pull in air that wasn't there. Then came the moment that sucked the oxygen out of the courtroom. The audio filters I'd designed stripped away the ambient noise, leaving only Julian's voice, clear as a bell, die quietly, Gracie. The video showed my body go limp, the 12 seconds where I lay dead, on the floor, and the smirk on his face as he wiped the door handle. When the screen went black, the silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, suffocating the defense table under the weight of irrefutable truth. The shark lawyer was pale, but he wasn't done thrashing. He jumped to his feet, desperate to salvage the narrative with a modern twist. Objection, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. In the age of AI, this could be anything. A deep fake. We demand an independent expert analyze this footage before it is admitted. We cannot accept this digital fabrication. It was a Hail Mary pass, a frantic attempt to use technology as a shield against reality. He looked at Frank for approval, and for a second, I saw hope flicker in Frank. Sighs, a belief that he could buy his way out of this technicality too. Elena didn't even look at him. She walked toward the bench, holding a single crisp document. That won't be necessary, Your Honor, she said, turning to face the courtroom. The victim is the expert. She handed the file to the judge. This affidavit confirms the metadata integrity, the hash values, and the anti-tamper protocols. It is signed by Special Agent Grace Miller, Senior Forensic Examiner for the Department of Justice. She paused, letting the title hang in the air like a guillotine blade. Unless defense counsel wishes to accuse the DOJ of fabricating evidence in a federal agent's home? The judge looked at the document, then at me, then at the defense attorney with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The defense attorney sank back into his chair, defeated. But the real victory was looking at Frank. For the first time in 20 years, he was really seeing me. Not Gracie the expense, not Gracie the failure, but Special Agent Miller, the woman who held the power to end his son's life as he knew it. He looked terrified. Julian put his head in his hands, finally understanding that Daddy's checkbook had no currency here. The judge slammed the gavel down, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Bail is denied. The defendant is remanded to custody immediately. My stepfather spent years telling Julian he was untouchable. But as the bailiff clicked the handcuffs shut, Julian finally touched something real. The cold, hard consequences of his own actions. The aftermath of the trial didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like waking up from a long, feverish nightmare into a morning that was finally blissfully quiet. The legal proceedings dragged on for months. A slow-motion car crash that my step-father, Frank, kept trying to steer despite having lost the wheel long ago. In the end, there was no grand jury acquittal, no miraculous loophole discovered by the expensive suit Frank had hired. The evidence, the undeniable mathematical truth of those 12 seconds, was a weight too heavy for even Frank's checkbook to lift. Julian accepted a plea deal for 15 years in a federal penitentiary to avoid a life sentence. I watched them lead him away. And for the first time in my life, I didn't see the golden boy. I saw a terrified man-child who was about to learn that in the federal system, there are no fathers to call and no bribes to pay. The internal ledger I had carried for years, the tally of his sneers, his stolen opportunities, the way he looked at me like I was furniture, didn't balance out. It just evaporated. He was gone. Frank, however, was still there, though he was a shadow of the tyrant I remembered. The scandal had been absolute. The legal fees had drained the liquidity from his accounts, and the revelation that his son was a violent predator had done the rest. His country club friends, the people he had spent a lifetime impressing, with his curated image of a perfect family, had vanished like smoke. He stood alone in the hallway of the courthouse, his suit looking a little looser than before, his face gray and etched with a bitterness that had nowhere left to go. He saw me walking toward the exit, flanked by 2 of my colleagues from the agency, men who actually respected the ground I walked on, and he stepped into my path. He didn't look at the bruises on my neck that had faded into faint yellow maps of violence. He looked right into my eyes, his jaw working tight with that old familiar rage. "You happy now?" He spat, his voice trembling not with sorrow but with accusation. "You destroyed this family. You ruined everything you touched." I stopped. The old Gracie, the invisible child who desperate for a crumb of validation, might have argued. She might have screamed that Julian tried to kill her, that she was the victim, that he had created the monster who choked me. I might have listed every birthday he forgot, every achievement he belittled, every time he told me I was broken for locking my door. But I looked at him, this small bankrupt man clinging to a narrative that no longer existed, and I realized he wasn't worth the oxygen it would take to explain it. I didn't say a word. I simply raised my hand, palm out, fingers together, a tactical halt signal I used in the field to stop a team from advancing into a kill zone. It was a command, not a request. I held it there for a second, watching his mouth open and close, his power completely neutralized by my refusal to engage. Then, I lowered my hand, stepped around him like he was a pylon in a parking lot, and walked out into the sunlight. I didn't look back. Returning to work wasn't just about going back to a job. It was about returning to the place where I made sense. My boss, Section Chief Miller, a man who regarded praise as a dangerous inefficiency, called me into his office the day I returned. He didn't ask how I was feeling or offer platitudes. He slid a file across his desk. "Your handling of the evidence was textbook," he said, which coming from him was the equivalent of a ticker tape parade. "We're opening a new division. Domestic surveillance forensics. We need someone who understands that the most dangerous threats aren't always foreign actors. Sometimes they have a key to the front door." I took the lead without hesitation. My life now is defined by a different kind of security. A few weeks ago, I found myself in a small apartment on the other side of the city installing a hardened surveillance loop for a young woman who had just left an abusive partner. She was shaking, apologizing profusely for being paranoid because she wanted cameras in her hallway. I stopped working, put down my tools, and looked her dead in the eye. You are not paranoid, I told her, my voice steady. You are prepared, and there is nothing more powerful than a woman who sees everything coming. I watched her shoulders drop, the tension leaving her body as I validated her. Reality. Something no one had ever done for me until I did it for myself. When I finished the install, I watched the monitors flicker to life, glowing with a beautiful, steady green status light. System secure. Last night I was sitting in my new office, the hum of the servers a comforting white noise, when my phone buzzed. It was a blocked number, but the voicemail transcription caught the first few words before I could stop it. It was my mother. The text preview read, "Gracie, please, we just want to move past this, we're family." I stared at the screen for a long moment. I thought about the hospital room, where she offered to pay my medical bills in exchange for my silence. I thought about the years of her standing by while Frank whittled me down to nothing. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the cool, detached resolve of a closed case file. I didn't listen to the message. I pressed delete, then block. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full. It was the sound of a life that finally, completely belonged to me. They told me to die quietly. Instead, I lived loudly enough to make sure the truth was the only thing that got heard. If you've ever had to save yourself because no one else would, hit that subscribe button. In this story, the victim is the one holding the camera.